Tov, which means in English, I wish you a good week. But let's start off. Tonight, we will recap the Haftarah, the prophetic portion that we read today in Temple. Speaking of temples, the temple that we pray in, wherever it is on planet Earth, is the blueprint of the original temple in Jerusalem that King Solomon constructed as per this week's prophetic reading. You have the building, you have the room. Then there's an altar, which is where they read the Torah from, the Bible from, Torah scroll. In the front, you have an ark, which is in the temple where they would keep the Ten Commandments in the Ark of the Covenant. Today, you recollect the leader of the services was the choir master. Today, you call him the chazan, the cantor. They call people up to read from the Torah. There's a Kohen, a priest, a Levi, Levite, and Israelites. And much of what we see, there's a menorah in many synagogues. So every time I walk into a synagogue, I'm thrown back 3,000 years to what it was like in Jerusalem to pray in the temple. So let's get right into it. So the Parsha, the Torah portion, describes the construction of the tabernacle, the Mishkan. That was the temporary dwelling that lasted from the construction at the time of the Exodus in the year 2448 and 40 years in the desert, and then 440 years in the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem until the temple went up. The temple, King Solomon's temple, the Beit HaMikdash, the Beit Hashem. So that's the connection. In the Torah reading, it's Moses and Aaron that are leading the nation. Today, King David's son is the one. Now, how old was King David's son at the time, Shlomo? When his father passed away at 70, Shlomo was 12. He waited till he was 16. He waited 4 years until the groundbreaking of the construction of the temple. So he's 16. And the construction of the temple took 7 years. So he's all of 23 years old. We know a lot about Solomon. He wrote 3 books. One of them, Ecclesiastes, Mishlei, Shir Hashirim, the Song of Songs, and also Kohelet, which is one of his other names. He had 7 names. He was very wealthy. He was also known to be the smartest man in the world at the time. So we know that the Queen of Sheba traveled a long journey in those days from Ethiopia to quiz him. So who is this guy? How smart can one man be? And we have a recording, not the audio recording, but a record of the questions that she asked him. And she comes to his throne and she's asking him questions. And afterwards she says, oh my God, he is far more intelligent, wise than his reputation. So she was glad she made the trip. Let's get into the Haftarah. It comes from the book of Kings, Melachim 1, and it comes from chapter 5, verse 26. So now we're going to describe what happened in Jerusalem to Solomon as he's about to build the temple. Va'adonai, and God. Natan chachma l'shlomo. God gave wisdom to Solomon, the divine wisdom. Ka'asher diber lo, as God spoke to him. Vayihi shalom ben Hiram. Who's Hiram? Hiram is his English name. There's a whiskey, Hiram Walker. That's where that name comes from, right here. Uvein Shlomo. So they form a pact. How come? Israel, they were agricultural people. They weren't laborers and construction people. And Shlomo contracted with Hiram, who was the king of Tyre, Tsor, which is where Lebanon was. Vayikresu bris shnehem. And he makes a pact. He makes an agreement that Hiram is going to do the labor. And Vayal Melech Shlomo mas mikol Yisrael. So how do you pay for all these laborers? Wait till you see the staff they had. Vayehi hamash shloshim elef ish. So instead of a financial tax, he also needed a labor tax. So he took 30,000 men, he delineated them, and he said to the first 10,000, okay, you go up for 1 month. Vayishlachem levanona, aseret alafim b'chodesh. He sent up 10,000 in a month, chalifot, and then they would change chodesh yihu b'levonon, shnaim chodeshim b'veiso. So they go up for 1 month, then they rest for 2 months. The next time they go up for a month, and they rest for 2 months. So they were on a 90-day cycle for 7 years. So if you think about it, there were 4 trips a year, and there were 7 years. Works out to 28 cycles, 28 visits. That was the tax, of labor tax. And the Adoni Ram, they appointed a man named Adoni Ram al Hamas. There was a man in charge of the labor force, and his name was Adoni Ram. What does that name mean? Adoni, my Lord, Ram is great. Next pasuk, 29 of Kings 5, Kings 1:5. Vayhi Shlomo, and it was for Shlomo, Shivim elef nosei sabal, that he had 70,000 carriers of the stones, Ushmonim elef chotzev bahar, and there were 80,000 people that are cutting the stone out of the mountain or pulling them out. Levad misarei hanitzavim lishlomo. Besides that, there was 3,300 supervisors of the 150,000 people. Ushloshet meo, 3,300. Ha-rodim ba'am ha'osim ba'mlacha. That they were urging the workers, hey, you're doing great, keep going. Vayitzav HaMelech, and the king commands, Vayasi'u avanim gedolot, avanim yakarot, liyased habayis avnei gozit. And the king's command, they would quarry these huge stones. If you go to Jerusalem and you look at the Western Wall, or especially on the tunnel tour underneath, these stones are humongous, and they were very, very expensive just to quarry them. I mean, they're just stone. They're, I think, basalt, but still cost a lot of money. Vayifselu bonei Shlomo uvonei Hiram v'hagvilim, and that Solomon's masons and Hiram's masons and the Gibalites, and these people were skilled in chiseling and construction. Vayachinu ha'etzim va'avanim livnos habayis, and they were the ones that prepared the stones to build a house. End of chapter 5. 13 verses to go. We'll push on the pedal. Vayehi, and there it was in the pasuk 1 of chapter 6. Bishmonim shana v'arba'a meo shana l'tzeit b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. So 480 years after the Israelites left Egypt, Bashana HaRevi'i, in the 4th year of King Solomon's reign, 12, now he's 16, Bachodesh Ziv. When we use the calendar in Judaism today, you say it's Tishrei, it's Cheshvan, it's Kislev. Those names are not Jewish. Those names are Babylonian. You go, huh? How come you have Babylonian names? What happened? In the year 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, marched upon Jerusalem, sieged it, surrounded, starved the people, murdered the people, destroyed the temple, exiled the intelligentsia and the wealthy. Okay, fine. So then, while we were in Babylonia for the 70-year exile, 52 were in Babylonia, and then Babylonia was taken over by the Persians. Go, Persia. They adapted the names of the calendar in Babylonia. That's how we use their names, because when we came back, we just called it by that name. And Ziv was one of the very, very few Jewish Hebrew names of months. Hu HaChodesh Hasheni is the second month. Now, if you think the first month is Rosh Hashanah in September and that the next month is the second month, wrong. From the year 2448, when the Israelites were in Egypt and the great jailbreak of all time took place, that was the first month, which then became known as Nisan, which then the next month after that was Iyar, Babylonian name, which is the second month, and he began to build God's temple. Ziv means bloom, and Iyar, being the month in which the trees bloom, makes sense to call it that. Verse 2. Now you get the tape measure. It was 60 cubits long. A cubit could be 18 inches. Some people say it could be 2 feet. Nothing was that exact in those days. The Amma cubit is interesting because they would take the rope and they would go like this. And this is roughly 18 inches. And when they would go like this, they would go like this. They would measure, if it was 60 cubits, 30 laps if you were swimming. Each way was 18 inches. Archova Esrim Rachba, 20 cubits wide, and Shloshim Amakomaso, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. 3. V'ha'ulam al pnei heichal habayis esrim ama, the hall that was in front of the sanctuary of the temple, that was 20 cubits long, along with the width of the temple, and it was 10 cubits deep in front of the temple. So it's describing the rectangle, and in front of it, another section. Vayas labayis chalonei shekufim atumim. He made windows for the temple. Who? He, King Solomon, with the help of Hiram. And it was wide at the outside and narrow within. That's not physical universe logic. Because if the sunlight is coming in, like a flashlight, somebody said, the flashlight, it's narrow where the light comes and then it radiates outwards. This was the other way. So to speak, the spiritual light was coming out of the temple. So we continue. 5. Vayiven al kir habayis yotzia saviv es kiros habayis saviv lehechal v'ladavir vayas silaot saviv. You don't understand Hebrew. Let me translate. He built a 15 cubit tall side structure abutting the wall of the temple all around. This was the pied à terre of the Kohanim, of the priests. He made this side structure out of side chambers surrounding the northwest and south walls of the temple, both of the outer sanctuary and of the inner chamber of the Holy of Holies. So it's describing subcategories of the overall large building. I'll stick to English. The side structure had 3 stories. 1, 2, 3. And each story was 5 cubits high, 5 times 18. You have 90 inches, so it was roughly 5 cubits, 90 inches would be 6 feet. That's 72. 7 feet, 84. 7 feet plus. On the northern and southern sides, there were 5 chambers on each story. This is, we were talking about the residences of the Kohanim, the priests that were in Jerusalem. Every 2 weeks, the different family of Kohanim would come and serve in the temple. So they needed a place to stay. So there were 3 chambers on the first story, 2 stories, and 2 chambers on the. It was 3 chambers on the first of the stories, then 2 when you go upstairs, and then on the third story there was also 2 chambers. The side structure gives the dimensions, so it's describing that. And the temple, we're moving on, was constructed completely of stones that were cut out of the quarry. They did not use hammers or axes or any tools of iron, because iron was a metal, obviously, and they would use it in swords and spears and tanks. So they didn't want to have the energy of war making the stones ready for the temple. Pesach Hatzela, and there was the door of the lowest row of chambers was in the middle chamber of the right side of the temple, and one would ascend. This is interesting, everybody. Listen up. Via a spiral staircase, spiritual spiral staircase from the lowest story in the middle row and from the middle into the third row. So they would actually go up the steps in a circular motion. Vayiven es habayis vayechalehu. Thus he built the temple and completed it. Vayispon. And then he covered es habayis gevim, paneled usedeiros ba'arazim. So it had shingles, gevim was shingles, and usedeirot ba'arazim was paneled with cedar wood. Vayiven es hayatzia al kol habayis chamesh amos kamaso. And then he built the side structure along the whole temple. Sounds repetitive, but it isn't. Each story was 5 cubits high. Thus, the height of the side structure was 15 cubits high, 18 inches times 15, about 22 and a half feet, plus the thickness of its ceilings and floors. He roofed the temple with cedar wood, cedar of Lebanon. Right? We know we have a hospital called Cedars of Lebanon or Cedar Sinai. This wood was known as the most exceptional, strong, and beautiful wood. 11. Vahidavar anayel Shlomo lemor. Here we're coming to the completion of the Haftarah. Habayis hazeh, this house, asher ata voneh, that you are building, this temple, im telech b'chukosai. God is speaking to Shlomo, to King Solomon, the boy king. Ve'es mishpatai ta'aseh, and you keep my rules. Ve'shamarta es mitzvosai, and you keep my judgments, laleches bahem, and follow them. V'hakimosi es divori, and then I, God, not I, Reuben, God, I, God, will fulfill through you my word. That Solomon was God's emissary and liaison to humanity. Asher dibarti el David. Who's David? Avicha. That I spoke those words, follow my ways, and here's the God's promise. V'shachanti besoch b'nei Yisrael. And then I am going to dwell among the Israel, the sons of Israel, literally the man named Israel, who originally was Yaakov, who was the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. V'lo e'ezov et ami Yisrael. And then I will not forsake, I will not abandon my people Israel. So this is just got to be one of those special Haftorahs that is the foundation, literally the foundation stone of Judaism vis-a-vis the worshiping originally in the Mishkan, Vishachanti Mishkan, I will dwell. So that word is used. And then 480 years later, building the temple. And this temple stood for 420 years until its destruction in 586 BCE. But let's end on a happy note. God said, come to my house. Don't be a stranger. Pick up and go to synagogue, go to temple, go wherever you gather together with people to pray to God and celebrate the gift that you have. Shavua Tov. Nice learning Torah with you.